Venerable members of the Sangha, both the Bhikkhu Sangha, Bhikkhuni Sangha, distinguished guests, and dear friends. First, I want to say that it's a great honor for me to have been invited to give the keynote address at this conference. And also I want to commend the Mahabodhi Society of India, and especially Venerable Seewalee, for conceiving the idea of holding annual conferences at Bodh Gaya on topics related to Buddhism that are extremely important in today's world. I think it's important for us Buddhists not to be just engaged in ceremony and ritual or in our personal meditation practice, but also to draw upon the resources of the Buddha Dharma in order to speak to some of the momentous crises that humanity is facing at the current time. And I think it's quite timely also that the Venerable chose the topic of women's liberation as the theme for the present conference. And I'm going to speak on this topic. I'm not going to speak primarily about the debated issue about bhikkhuni ordination, which I'll touch on, but it's not the primary focus of my presentation. I'm going to deal with the issue of women's liberation from both the secular and the spiritual points of view. And when we speak of women's liberation, we first have to determine what women are to be liberated from. What are the obstacles to their freedom? There have been many manifestations of these obstacles to women's liberation throughout time. They have shackled women from ancient times to the present, and they cut clear across geographical boundaries, from north to south, from east to west. Perhaps the most pervasive and the most subtly disempowering obstacle to women's liberation is the limitations that have been placed on them, on the opportunities available to them for personal expression and achievement. In traditional cultures, and even in the West today, these limitations are considered almost mandatory, intrinsic to the social order. There's a kind of unspoken consensus that casts women into stereotyped roles that severely hamper their freedom to realize their creative potentials. They're expected to be wives and mothers, to take care of the family, and to exhaust their role in maintaining the household, bearing children, and looking after the children until they're old enough to take care of themselves. Today, however, under the impact of the modern ideal of human equality, women have been entering into almost all the spheres of activity traditionally considered the exclusive prerogative of men. Women have excelled as doctors and lawyers, corporate executives. They've achieved eminence as scientists and engineers, and has even served in government and become heads of state. Nevertheless, even though some women have risen to the top, the openings available to them have been much fewer than those open to men, and the requirements imposed on them to climb the ladder of success are much steeper than they are for men. In many countries, especially in Asia, women are condemned to work at menial jobs, often monotonous, arduous, and dangerous. They work for lower pay than their male counterparts who perform the same work, and yet they receive fewer benefits. Apart from vocational limitations, women face other obstacles to their full liberation. For one thing, women are disproportionately subject to physical violence with few opportunities to rectify their grievances. Physical violence is common at the home front and can even result in the deaths of a wife and daughters. In India, a wife who disappoints her in-laws, usually because she brings in an inadequate dowry, might be killed by them or driven to such despair that she resorts to suicide. A report issued in 1997 claims that at least 5,000 women die each year in India because of dowry conflicts, and at least a dozen die each day in so-called kitchen fires. These are fires that break out in the kitchen in which a woman is burned to death, and these are usually thought to be intentionally instigated by the woman's in-laws. Women in poor countries often fall victim to human trafficking. They're shipped from their home country to other countries, usually compelled to perform degrading work, usually prostitution or other types of sex work. Still, another violation of women's rights is sexual harassment, which again assumes multiple forms, from sexual pressure at work to taunts and insults relating to sex. The extreme manifestation of sexual abuse is rape, yet in the current social milieu, even in the advanced Western countries, it is extremely hard for women to report rape to the authorities. Often, their claims of rape are dismissed as implausible, or the women are regarded as temptresses who brought the rape on themselves through their own provocative behavior. A case in point, I explained in more detail, but I'll just mention it here, is one that gained worldwide publicity in the United States last autumn when a woman named Christine Blasey Ford reported that Donald Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh, had attempted to rape her when they were high school students. And when this issue came before the male-dominated Senate Judiciary Committee, the members of the committee, particularly, or I should say exclusively the Republicans, denigrated her testimony and went on to confirm Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court nomination. Okay, so what are some of the steps that can be taken for the liberation of women in the secular domain? Here I've mentioned 4 key measures, though there might be many that I'm not able to touch on and not aware of. The first, and I want to really underscore this extremely important, is opening up opportunities for girls to receive an education, from primary school through high school to college and on to postgraduate education. This is especially crucial in traditional societies where it's often believed that girls don't have to attend school because when they reach marriageable age, they're going to get married and bear children, and that's the end of the road for them. But now women are aspiring and have the right to unfold their potentialities, and to do that, they need an education. And I want to mention that 10 years ago, together with some of my students and Dharma friends, we founded an organization based in the US called Buddhist Global Relief, which has the specific mission of combating chronic hunger and malnutrition around the world. But when we looked into the issue of what are the underlying roots of poverty, hunger, and malnutrition, we found that one of the main supporting factors was the subordinate status of girls and women in many traditional societies. So the specific main tactic that we developed for combating poverty and chronic hunger is to support the education of women. We have projects like this in Cambodia, India, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Haiti, the Cameroon in West Africa, and other countries. One example of how this project works, we partner with an organization in Cambodia called Lotus Outreach, whereby we provide, I wonder if there's this work going on right outside here, which is creating a noise that's, I think, reducing the audibility of. Okay, so we provide rice to the families of these girls from the poorest stratum of society in Cambodia. So poor that you can't even imagine the conditions under which they're living. So we provide rice to the families on condition that they allow the girls to remain in school. As a result, many of these girls, several hundred, have gone through primary school, high school, and a good number have gone on to college and universities, where they're studying to be scientists, doctors, lawyers, teachers, girls who a generation ago would never have conceived of such a possibility. So education is, I would say, the primary key to the liberation of women in the secular domain of life. Okay, a second measure is legal protection to women from domestic violence and sexual harassment in all of its forms. In particular, attitudes towards rape have to change. The legal system has to recognize the disastrous impact that rape has on a woman's self-esteem, and a woman's accusations of rape and other forms of domestic violence have to be taken seriously with sympathy and understanding. One practical way to deal with this problem because often the police and judges in the courts, they're almost always male, who are going to side with the males who are accused rather than with the women making the accusations. So one practical way to deal with this problem would be to establish legal agencies run either by the government or privately managed that can serve as intermediaries between the women who feel violated and the civil authorities, the police and the courts. These agencies would be staffed by legal professionals, preferably women, who would hear the complaints of the women and represent them in their interactions with the police and the courts. A third measure to support the liberation of women from subordinate positions in society would be for a society, a government, to establish quotas for female representation in business, in government service, and in political administration. The quotas would ensure that women are admitted to positions of responsibility, and as they gain increasing visibility and authority, this would ensure that in the future, more women gain the opportunity to rise. But now I come to the fourth measure, where I say that liberating women from the restrictions on their freedom will require far more than changes in the legal system, but will require far-reaching changes in social customs, and that in turn requires a change in perceptions, a radical shift away from traditional attitudes that demean women and ascribe a lower value to their lives and capacities. We need to make a complete turn away from the deeply entrenched patriarchal model that gives pride of place to men, replacing it with a model founded upon the equality of the sexes. Liberation for women in all spheres, secular and spiritual, requires above all a deep recognition of their inherent dignity and honoring of their full humanity. Back in the 19th century, the British philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote a tract called On the Subjection of Women, in which he says that an opinion which I have held from the very earliest period is that the principle that legally subordinates one sex to the other is wrong itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement. And I say that it ought to be replaced by a principle of perfect equality, admitting no power or privileges on the one side, nor disability on the other. If this proposal by John Stuart Mill were to be fully implemented, a principle of perfect equality, were to be adopted. Women would enjoy equal rights at the workplace, including equal pay with males. They would be recognized as equal partners in marriage, with the right to determine whether and when they will bear children. They would be granted the full range of healthcare options, particularly the right to contraception, so that they can regulate their own reproduction. Okay, now I come to Buddhism and women's liberation. And I hope I'm not going to ruffle any feathers by what I have to say, though I think I will. Okay, so when we turn from the secular sphere to Buddhism, we find that its record with regard to women's liberation is a mixed one. On the one hand, the Buddha gave extraordinary respect to women and recognized their potentials in both mundane life and the spiritual domain. For example, in the Sigalovada Sutta, he describes the marital bond between husbands and wives as one in which the wife is a full and free partner in the relationship. With a great deal of hesitation, however, he sanctioned the creation of a monastic order for women, the Bhikkhuni Sangha, and he included women in the list of preeminent disciples, as Bhante Seewalee mentioned just before. Yet the Buddha's texts, including passages in the Nikayas, contain passages that demean women and devalue their moral and spiritual capacities. An example is a sutta called the Black Snake, in which says, women are like a black snake. They are impure, foul-smelling, frightening, dangerous, and they betray friends. Another sutta says that women are unsatisfied with two things: sexual intercourse and giving birth. The Jataka stories go even further in representing women as obsessed by insatiable lust, even willing to plot against their husbands to satisfy their craving. Of course, sexual desire is a universal human trait, and women can't be expected to be arahats from birth. But still, the question comes to my mind: which gender is responsible for the multi-billion-dollar pornography industry? Is it males or females? Which gender keeps the brothels in business? Males or females? Which gender is most likely to engage in rape and sexual violence? The answers, I think, are obvious. In establishing the Bhikkhuni Sangha, the Buddha did not set it up in a position of complete equality with the Bhikkhu Sangha. That would have been unthinkable in the social milieu in which he lived. As we know, he subordinated it to the Bhikkhu Sangha in various ways. Bhikkhunis have to be ordained by both communities, while bhikkhus are ordained only by the Bhikkhu Sangha. A senior bhikkhuni has to pay homage to a newly ordained bhikkhu. A bhikkhuni cannot reproach a bhikkhu, while a bhikkhu can reproach a bhikkhuni, and so forth. And then in the text, the Buddha is seen to predict that the going forth of women will cause the lifespan of the good Dharma to be cut in half, a statement that has probably been partly responsible for the negative ideas that many monks hold about the revival of the Bhikkhuni Sangha. This development has been a divisive issue over which a narrow conservatism in the Sangha has become a major stumbling block to allowing women to realize their highest spiritual potentials. Yet, in my view, for Buddhism to become a true advocate for women's liberation, it is crucial that the schools, the Theravada school and Tibetan Buddhism, restore their respective Bhikkhuni Sanghas. It is not enough for small groups of progressive-minded monks to hold Bhikkhuni ordinations. It is necessary in the heartlands of traditional Buddhism to have the status of bhikkhunis recognized by the Sangha authorities and, where relevant, officially endorsed by the government. And here I have to applaud the Sri Lankan bhikkhus for taking the initiative in bringing the Bhikkhuni Sangha back to life. This step has called for exceptional courage, compassion, and foresight into the needs of our time. In other Theravada countries, however, in Thailand and in Myanmar, this kind of rigid conservatism still prevails and stands in the way of the recognition of bhikkhunis and thereby in the way of women's full liberation. I believe that if Buddhism is to thrive in the contemporary world, if it is to convey a convincing message to educated people today, it has to come into harmony with the egalitarian spirit of our time. Otherwise, Buddhism is going to appear to be an archaic, gender-based patriarchy dominated by males intent on retaining their privileged status. Further, in the spirit of our present age, I believe we need a broader and more egalitarian vision of monastic life than is possible within the contours of traditional Buddhism. Of course, it's necessary to follow the guidelines laid down in the Vinaya for the relations between the two communities, but we also have to recognize that many of those guidelines were formulated under specific historical and cultural conditions that are now quite dated. The Buddha was inevitably constrained by the prevailing attitudes of the society in which he lived, but in our own time, Buddhism must adapt to an age in which equality between males and females has become the widely accepted standard. The values at the heart of the Dhamma resonate well with what I would call the feminine point of view, and thus I feel that these values should be clearly articulated and embodied in our Buddhist communities. Of course, tradition also has a claim on our allegiance, and we shouldn't be in a hurry to discard it. Without the strength and conserving force of condition, much that is central to the Dhamma could be diluted or lost. What we need to do is to strike a healthy balance between the preservation of ancient forms and adaptation to present realities. If we hasten to innovate and neglect tradition, we might lose our anchorage in the continuous heritage of Buddhism. But we shouldn't let dogmatic conservatism have the final word. Rather, if we do something like that, we might find ourselves left with merely a dried out shell of the Dharma without its living essence. Beyond specific applications to Buddhism, I would say also that the full liberation of women in all spheres of life is critical to the survival of human civilization. From the dawn of history up to the present, the primary driving forces of civilization have been male attitudes, male values, humanity close to the edge of self-annihilation. To draw us back from the edge of the cliff, we need to listen to women. Generalizations are always dangerous, but I would posit 3 values deeply rooted in the masculine mind that have been driving the course of human history up to the present. These 3 are conquest, competition, and exploitation. We see the urge to conquer and subdue others in the culture of militarism and war. We saw it in the colonial period where the powers of Europe conquered the rest of the world and divided them up among themselves. We saw it in the last century in the explosion in 2 world wars and in the long-standing Cold War. And we see it today in the many minor wars going on around the world. Okay, the second driving force is competition, which has led to the rise of a harsh economic system, that of corporate capitalism, in which the claims of human sympathy are pushed aside in the brute struggle for economic dominance. In this system, all value is reduced to monetary value. All virtues are downplayed in favor of wealth and ambition. Is the attitude of exploitation, which governs humanity's relationship with the natural world. We regard nature as little more than a source of materials for production, to produce goods for consumption, and thus we seek to exploit its resources in compliance with commercial motives. One consequence of this has been the escalating climate crisis, which threatens the future of human civilization on this planet. In place of competition, we need cooperation in building a society governed by more egalitarian ideals, a society that provides everyone with their essential needs: food, healthcare, education, meaningful work, and other basic. The exploitation of nature's abundant resources, we need an attitude of respect for nature and a sustainable economy, leading to the emergence of a culture marked by deep appreciation for the irreplaceable wonders of the natural world. It is in promoting and actualizing these life-affirming values that I believe women can make an indispensable contribution to our shared human future, not only for the liberation of women, but for the common liberation of all human beings. Thank you very much, and may all blessings be with you.